All right, so hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan, and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson.
Hi, I'm Angela Beaumont, and I'm the Director of Operations at the Jefferson. Joining us in conversations today is Yvonne Caputo. She's the author of Flying with Dad, which is the result of 2 years of long-distance phone calls with her father, who was a B-24 bomber in World War II. She has been a storyteller all her life as a teacher, psychotherapist, corporate trainer, and consultant. She's used stories to widen the eyes of her students, soften the pain in the hearts of her clients, and bring a point home for her audience.
Folks, since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we will work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you do have a question, just leave it in the comment section below, and we're going to do our best to get to those as we can.
And if you're watching a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us questions, and we'll get them along to Yvonne as best as we can.
And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website, www.jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Ms. Yvonne Caputo, thank you so much for joining us today. What an accomplished woman with what a great story. We're excited to have this conversation with you today. Thank you for joining.
I'm glad to be here. Actually, Erie is one of my favorite places in the whole wide world.
And we are broadcasting from Erie today. Yvonne, you actually have an Erie connection. Before we get into the book, could you tell us about that, please?
I do. I was born and raised in Meadville, which is not far from Erie. I did all of my undergraduate and graduate degrees at Edinburgh. And that landed me a job in Erie at the Human Relations Commission, I would think, right, 1969. What happened at the commission was I rediscovered my love of teaching and pushed to go back into teaching. And I spent the next 18 years teaching for the Erie City School District. And I had a variety of positions. I've seen on your website, Johnny Johnson, Pat Capabianca, Joyce Savacchio. Those are all people that I worked with way back when. So the only thing that brought me from Erie to southeastern Pennsylvania was that I got married. And my husband had 2 small children from a previous marriage, and he was really committed to stay 10 minutes from them. So I landed in southeastern Pennsylvania and have been here ever since. But Erie is a place that I continue to visit frequently. One of my very best friends, college roommates, Mary Desmond, lives in Erie, and I still come to visit her frequently.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
And Yvonne, we're looking forward to getting you back to Erie as soon as we can. It is certainly Erie's loss and the southeastern Pennsylvania's gain, but we are so happy for you and so happy to have you here today. I think we can go on and talk about your Erie connections, but in fact, that's not what brings us to our discussion today. We're actually to discuss the story behind your recently published book, Flying with Dad, what you experienced and learned while interviewing your father, how you became a writer. Now, I'm a writer at heart. I love talking to authors who, unlike me, actually written and completed and published their books. So I want to get into that. And maybe the best place to start would be, you can give us a Cliff's Note version of the book for those who have not had a chance to read it. Talk to us about that, and then what really led to your decision to become an author, because as we heard in the intro, you've done a lot.
Okay, so Flying with Dad. I have to say, holding the book in my hand is still, and I'm trying to think of the right word. I never dreamed that I would be an author. In 2008, Dad was still living in Meadville. We would do our weekly phone calls. I struggled with that about what we would talk about. We would get through his medical conditions and latest visits to the doctors and a little bit about the sports team, but I wasn't a sports nut. But one night in January, he opened up and told me this quirky, funny, off-the-wall story about finding French champagne in freed Belgium and putting it on the B-24 and flying it back to Rockies. And I said, during our conversation, I said, Dad, I want to go get a pencil and paper. I want to take notes. And him, in his deep voice, said, what in the world do you want to do that for? And I said, well, I think this is really interesting. And maybe some of these stories should be written down for your kids and your grandkids. The next week, what moved me, I don't know. But I said, if you're willing, start at the beginning. How did you get into the war? Well, he did start. He started with graduating from high school in 1939 in the midst of the Depression and not having a job. And he said that someone suggested that he go to the Unemployment Bureau and see if they could help. He ended up in Roosevelt's Youth Administration program, learning to repair airplanes at Middletown, which is now Hershey International Airport. And that was really the crux of it. You know, start at the beginning, all right? So we went from Middletown to Augusta, Georgia, which was his first full-time job at a depot in Augusta. And at Augusta, he meets Hap Arnold, who is the general of the Air Corps back then. And Arnold tells him that he's not going to stay in Augusta, that he's going to go to Macon. So his next hop is Macon, Georgia. At Macon, Georgia, he repairs the wing of an AT-6. He builds it from scratch. And when the pilot goes to test it, he tells my father to get in. You know, because is this thing going to fly? Dad said to me on the phone, he said, I didn't want to fix them anymore, hon. I wanted to fly them. So it took him 4 months to get out of his presidential deferment and enter the Corps. And poor guy, basic training was Miami Beach. Billeted in a hotel. Hard life. From Miami Beach to Meadville, to Allegheny College, of all places. There were so many guys going into cadets that they needed to slow the process down. So they incorporated having them do a full semester of college work. So he was at Meadville at Allegheny, where he met my mom. And after Allegheny, San Antonio for pre-flight, Harlingen Air Force Base for gunnery school, San Marcos for navigation school, on to Charleston to meet his crew, flying to Rockies to at the end of February or beginning of February 1945, to then starting to fly missions over Germany and France. And so that's how it all kind of like rolled out. It was like from place to place to place, and then stories within each of those places. So at the end, I had all of these notes, and I sent Dad the first 4 chapters, and he said, honey, it's missing something. I said, what's it missing? Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it does matter, Dad. No, it doesn't matter. So back and forth we went, and he finally said, combat was terrifying. It's the first time my father ever admitted to what it was like to be in the sky and letting those bombs go. So that's basically the cliff notes of the story. It did go on further because Dad didn't leave the reserves until 1969 as a captain. And then when I did like the third draft of the book, I really felt like it was important to include the other kinds of accomplishments that he made along the way. So the book goes from his graduation from high school to his death in 2010.
And I think such an important part of capturing all of that is your decision to start recording these conversations and then writing them down and turning them into. So tell us just a little bit about the decision to say, rather than just having a conversation with Dad, I'm now recording, and we're going to see where this goes. And we know where this goes now because you've got the book.
The story's really in the beginning. Even the whole story, that first draft, was really meant for the family. I had no idea that I was going to publish a book. But I started to think about it. And then I started to do some research. I went online to look for a full story of just an ordinary GI. You know, there's plenty of really heavy duty battles. There's plenty about some really incredible generals. There's plenty about Churchill. But I didn't see all across the internet a book that talked just about an ordinary GI. And there were plenty of them. There were 7,000 of them that died in Dad's Air Division alone. So I thought, maybe there is a wider audience. And that's when it started to kind of churn in my head. Maybe I've got a book. And I will always admit to, I know when I don't know. I know about publishing a book. I didn't know what you needed to do to get something to publication. So I started to reach out to professionals. And so the second draft happened. And then I reached out to more professionals, and the third draft happened. And it was in the third draft that people kept saying to me, "Where are you? Where are you in the book?" And I said, "I'm not in the book. This is a book about Dad. Well, you need to be in the book." And I had professionals recommend that I read Tuesdays with Morrie. And then I had someone recommend that I read Scott Simon's Unforgettable. And all of a sudden, it really began to dawn on me how really powerful the book could be if it were not just the war, but how the book gave me the dad that I always wanted. And I got he got a daughter that he didn't know he had. So much more was coming out of the book. It was the building of a relationship with this man that I dearly loved, but wasn't necessarily very close to.
Thank you, Yvonne. That was really impactful and powerful. Angela, I'm going to turn it to you for the next question while I'm still ruminating on that one.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. That building bridges seem to be a theme that goes throughout the book that you mentioned several times in our conversations prior to this event here. So the MIT Technology Review has estimated that more than 26 million people have taken an at-home ancestry test by 2019. To me, that's an astonishing number. So the interest in our past, in that of family members, has become a nationwide pastime activity, and it can help build those bridges. So what was the effect of having these calls and the relationship with your father on him, on you? Did you talk about this actually, how this book brought you together? Did you discover it at some point, both of you?
We did. One of the most powerful moments was the weekend before Dad passed away. And I went back to Meadville, and he was in the hospital. And I took the first draft and I put it on his belly, and he started to read, and we read together. And I said to Dad, I said, "I'm so proud of you. I am so proud of your service." And he said, "No, honey, I'm proud of you. You wrote the book." It was little things like that that happened all along the way in his storytelling. I'd have to say it was my interest in the stories that really made it start to happen. You know, I would follow up when he would say something that didn't seem real to me. Like on one of the missions, he dropped napalm. Napalm wasn't in his plane per se. His had incendiary bombs, but napalm was dropped on that mission. When he would say things like that to me, I would want to know more. And then I'd do research, and then I'd hand the research back to him in terms of what I found. Well, little by little, he began to open up and share his heart and soul. And conversations we would have were so poignant in that many times he would say, honey, I want to go. I just want to be with your mom. And we would talk about that, you know, and my response, thank God I worked in a nursing home at one point. My response was not, oh, Dad, don't tell me stuff like that. It was, tell me more. Well, what makes you feel like that? Well, what's going on? And he would just open up. And there was a trust level that just started to build. That on the last, I remember this clearly, the last phone call that he had, he said to me, can you come home? I'm scared. And I said, I'll be there tomorrow. But that's the journey that we had made, that he had gotten to this point where he could say those kinds of things to me, knowing that I would take it to heart. And of course, I said to him, I said, I'll be home tomorrow. He said, can you take a leave of absence? I said, sure. And I said to him, I said, and Dad, by the way, we've got to find plan B because you can't live alone anymore. And he said, I know. But I got home and 2 hours later, he was gone. He waited for me to come home. That's where he and I had come to as father and daughter through all of this storytelling.
So Yvonne, I've got to follow up there, and you know, I just think writing in general is hard. You know, I think sometimes people don't think about the work that goes into the process and the research that you talked about and the going from draft to draft to draft. But writing about a family member is even harder, I have to imagine, and being able to capture that. That is just moving to hear your story there and your connection with your dad up into the end. How did you find yourself in the process? Did you find yourself emotionally drained while you were writing this, or did you feel that this was an outlet for that energy, some way that you could channel it? Tell us about that feeling you had while you were in the thick of it, writing not only a challenging book to begin with, but a book about your father and a connection you're now reestablishing with him. What was that like? Was that draining? Was it a good source of energy? How did it feel?
One of the things I often tell my clients is that sound mental health is the ability to contain the paradox. And so, Ben, to answer your question, it was paradoxical all the way through. There were times when I was writing and I would be reliving a story with Dad that I would just dissolve into tears. There were times when I was writing a story that I was in absolute joy. So, you know, that was the paradoxical part of it. The other piece of it is that if I'm a therapist and I try to help people be more comfortable with what they're feeling, then I knew I needed to be comfortable with my own feelings. You know, that I knew I needed to just kind of sit in whatever it was, wherever it was taking me. Now, in the fourth draft, and this is the final one, when I'm working with my publisher, the difficulty I had was not making a saint out of Dad, of having to create this character who was flawed, and to talk about myself, you know, as if I was flawed. And I am flawed. We all are. So there was a tug of war that went on with that. But the more I kind of got into that dichotomy, the richer the story became. So I hope that answers the question, Ben. But it was, I have to say, once I got into it, I loved sitting at the computer. I loved the process of writing. I didn't like the editorial part.
That's maybe one of the questions we can get to is, you know, how do you feel about working with editors? Because I happen to wear a writer hat sometimes and an editor hat the other, and I know they're often at odds with each other and they don't always get along. But hopefully for the sake of the process, it all works out and it's better. Let's dive into some of the chapters of your book. Angela, you had a great observation about one of the chapters in Yvonne's book, so I want to turn it back to you.
Yeah, I do have your book, and I just enjoyed very much. It's, you know, the layout, the photo, everything is really very, very appealing. So thank you. I have a little bit of a personal story, a question here. When I, you know, flipped through the chapters and the titles, I got stuck on Unter Schlauersbach. So Flying with Dad is both a memoir and a World War II history. I'm a German native and my father fought on the other side. But I also wish I had taken more time for conversations with him. The only writings I have are his letters to his mother that he wrote while being stationed at the front. So conversations like the ones you had would have helped me understand him and his generation better. What about Unter Schlauersbach? Would you mind telling our viewers what this chapter is about? Did any of your father's stories particularly surprise you?
There were many surprises. I have to say that Unter Schlauersbach was something that I had known even before the writing of this. And how I knew the story was that my father sold insurance for Prudential. And back in those days, he would go from house to house collecting payments. And he got to one particular apartment, and the woman who answered the door had a German accent. And she said she couldn't take care of the payment right then, but to come back at night. Well, after they got the payment thing straightened out, Dad asked her where she came from. And she said, my home was in Unter Schlauersbach. But during the war, I was sent to my grandparents out in the country so that I would not be in danger. She said, but my parents died in a bombing raid at the end of the war in Unter Schlauersbach. My father was on that raid, and he remembered it clearly. Prior to them leaving, they always did a briefing. And during the briefing, they would get their coordinates, they would get, you know, what the site was. But in this particular briefing, they were told that Patton was very close by. And should they get the word when they got into Germany that they were not to bomb where Patton was, they were to turn around and start home, start back to Rakhine. And they needed to let those bombs go wherever they could. And Dad said that at one point they were flying so low, he could see the people in the fields kneeling, hoping that the bombs weren't going to be released. So that's the story I knew from childhood. Later on, as you read in the book, it became clear to me that that was a story of guilt that my father carried for his entire life, because those bombs killed civilians. They didn't kill soldiers. And so I really came to see that when my father had a chance to talk to my cousin Claude, who was a Vietnam vet. And they were able to share their stories. And And that was very shortly before Dad died. But that story is a powerful one for me. You know, that he carried that guilt for 60 years for having to let bombs go on civilians.
And such a powerful chapter. And so much of that is drawn out in your book, these conversations, and being able to look at your dad's memory and your research into own history and the impact of that. Yvonne, it's the 75th anniversary of the victory in Europe. You know, it was recently celebrated. So your book is so timely right now, and we encourage people to pick it up for that reason. But another great reason is that, you know, we have this ability to connect with a generation through your work, and we're seeing that connection now less and less and less as we continue to lose the your dads of the world, and we don't have their collective memories with us unless you're there to you know, really capture them. Your book unpacks those memories and how we can make sure that following generations don't forget those, and that they too can wrestle with that guilt and in those hard stories, and to the victory of the Allies over the Axis forces. What would you recommend to others looking into interviewing their parents? Maybe they're tuned into this conversation now thinking, I've got to start this process. I've got to talk to my parents, or I've got to talk to my grandparents, or I've got to talk to my family just to make sure we don't lose our own history. What recommendations would you have to them? You know, authors looking to write a memoir, what would you recommend to them?
The one caveat I would say is not to push for somebody who doesn't want to talk about it. And I think that there are still veterans out there that are not comfortable. But when you start to get your parents or your grandparents' stories, get comfortable. Listen. Ask who, what, when, where. See if you can get them to give you details. What I found with Dad that was really instructive to me was all he really needed was somebody who wanted to listen. The stories were always in there. Now, he was older and comfortable giving them, but I really just sat back and listened. And I didn't do any yes buts, and I didn't interrupt the flow of conversation. I just really wanted more and kept asking more. And I think the other thing that happened with Dad and I that's instructive for all of us is you start small. And as you build that trust level that the stories are going to be honored, then people will open up and they will tell you more. So that's would be my advice.
I think that's great advice for anybody looking to do that. Coupling it with find a good editor you can fight with, like you did. I'm going to come back to that, but we do have some quick questions, just, you know, curiosities that we've come up with. Angela, I'm going to turn it to you for the first of those, just a round of quick questions before we get to a few more before we conclude today's event.
Yvonne, this is your first book. Will you write another one?
I have a couple of them kind of spinning in my head right now. Just what direction that will take, I'm not sure. But I would like to write again. I mean, there's for me, there was such joy in it. I do miss that. Right now I'm into the marketing of the book, not so much fun. But but the writing of it was truly an adventure that I would like to repeat again.
And so, Yvonne, do you believe your book and story, those are comparable to Army stories told today?
I'm pausing a little bit. To answer that question in a way that would honor it, I would want to talk to Vietnam vets. I would want to talk to people who were in the Gulf War. I would not want to assume that my dad's story was their story. And this reminds me of a book that I read very early on when I started to see clients. And it was written by a psychiatrist, and he talked about the individuality of each person. You know, that each person's story was unique. So the only way I would want to even compare is if I had sat down and I had talked to that soldier that had been in the Gulf War, or I'd talked to that soldier who had been in Vietnam. There may be similarities, but there may be some very wide discrepancies.
Thank you.
So, was your dad an ordinary guy?
Not in the least. Actually, the original title for the book was An Extraordinary Ordinary Man.
That's a good title.
And you know, to look at his life, it was very ordinary, but there were things about him that made him an extraordinary human being. One of the things that, in terms of stories, when the war ended on August 14th, 1945, Dad wrote to Mother that he went back to base and went to church. He felt that that was where he needed to be to celebrate the end of the war. While wherever, I think he was in South Dakota at the time, but the whole town erupted. Looting happened. Cars were burned. That's not what he wanted to participate in. He said to my mother clearly, I just wanted to be in church. So yeah, extraordinary in that sense too.
So Yvonne, I've got a two-parter here. First is, what time of the day did you write? Are you a morning writer, an afternoon writer, an evening writer, a late night writer? When were you at the keyboard? And then part two for that is, what's your favorite thing to do after a long day or night or evening or afternoon of writing? How did you settle down? So when did you write, and then favorite thing to do afterwards?
I generally like to write first thing in the morning. That's always for me, oddly, when my head's clearest. It always seemed to be the easiest to get my thoughts down in paper when I was up and fresh. After writing, I'm an exercise nut. And there's nothing, I know this is strange, but there's nothing I look forward to more than doing my exercise routine. Going for a walk, you know, riding my bicycle, being on my Pilates machine, and then dinner and a glass of wine with my very best friend, my husband.
Well, maybe that's the answer to the next one, and I'll toss it to Angela for one last one. But aside from your dad, who was the biggest source of inspiration for writing for you for this project and for the projects that are kicking around in your head right now?
I have to talk about my editor, Ingenium Books, and Bonnie Wagner Stafford. I found Bonnie after I interviewed 4 different editors. My book is independently published. And on our very first conversation, I heard the feelings in her. I heard the resonance. I heard her dive into my story like this was really exciting. And then when she got my 3rd draft, she threw it in a blender, threw it back at me and said, this is where I think you need to go with it. And talk about a trust level. Bonnie really helped me craft this book that I now have in my hands. All right. So there's nothing like a good editor. There's absolutely nothing like a good editor. And I've read that. I mean, I've read that in the acknowledgments of books, and it never hit me. Of course it never does, you know, until you experience it yourself. But she helped me to think in terms of scenes. She helped me to think in terms of dialogue. She helped me to think in terms of keeping it simple, but keeping it rich.
That's great.
And if I could, then I want to acknowledge 2 living World War II vets
Absolutely.
that I am in close contact with. Wilson Noden was a navigator at Rack same time as my dad. They didn't know each other, but he read the final draft of my book and wrote a review. And he said I was factually accurate. Okay. But this dear man, we sat time after time and we talked about, like how to crawl up through the bomb bay, and there's a side panel to get into the navigator seat of a B-24. So Wilson was at the 467th Association reunion in Connecticut last year. That's where I met him. He lives an hour and a half away. Then the second person that I would like to acknowledge on this program is Joe Hahn. Joe is 103. He was the assistant crew chief on a plane, a B-24 called the Wabbit, W-A-B-B-I-T. The Wabbit is the plane that Dad was in when it crashed. I didn't know Joe before the book, but because of Facebook and connections, his granddaughter found me. She wanted a copy of the book. I find out that Joe is 7.2 miles away from me, living in a personal care home. We have never seen each other. We've never visited, but his story just made the hair on the back of my neck just go up. I asked him, I said, did you see the plane after it crashed? And he said, oh yeah. He said, it had to be salvaged. They couldn't have fixed it. And he said, as a matter of fact, he said, there was no nose. The nose of the plane was completely disintegrated. Then he went on to say, if anybody had been in the nose, they would not have walked away. The navigator's position normally in a B-24 is in the nose. My dad, because it was a training mission, was on the flight deck that day. So when the crash happened, he went up through the escape hatch at the top of the plane, slid down to the wing, jumped, and broke his leg. He was the only injury in that crash. So I just want to acknowledge the 2 wonderful living World War II vets who've been phenomenal new friends.
Thank you, Yvonne, for sharing that.
I have one final one of those quick questions here. You obviously spent a lot of time doing your research. What is your biggest takeaway from researching war?
We have no idea. And that comes from 2 different places. When Dad said combat was terrifying, I didn't push him for more, but the research that I did, Miller's 8th Air Force book has a whole chapter about flying 22,000 feet above the ground. It's not a pressurized cabin, okay? Air masks fog up, you can't breathe. In 2.5 minutes, you're gone. There's no medic on the plane. It's just harrowing, all right, in terms of really understanding what war was all about. But the other part of the research is the fun, the camaraderie, the relationships that these men built with each other because of the kind of work that they were doing. So that's what hooked me in the first place, uncovering French champagne in freed Belgium and transporting it back to Rack-Heath, and then divvying that French champagne up to both the non-coms and the commissioned officers. So there's that, again, that juxtaposition of the really awful and the really funny and heartwarming stuff.
So Yvonne, a big thank you for that round of questions. I know we're short on time here as we near the end of the event. So we've got 2 left for you, and you've unpacked so much for us today, from the writing process to the book itself. And I don't want to give it all away, because I want to encourage people to go and get your book and check that out. But there are a lot of almost books out there where people just can't seem to get past the revision and editing and one more crack at it. You said 4 drafts for yours. How did you finally know it was done, or be at peace with, I've got to just put it out there, that I can't keep going back to it and I can't keep tweaking it? It's finally finished. I want it to be out there. How did you get to that process? For those who are sitting out there with half finished, 3/4 finished, 9/10 finished manuscripts, how'd you finish it?
Well, here again, Ingenium Books and Bonnie. When she put that structure together, and then I went back and wrote, by the time I got that last chapter done, I was able to say to myself, this is finished. This is good. I really like what I have here. I don't know that I would have made it without her assistance. It was that relationship. But the other piece of this is, I just felt driven. I just knew that this is something that I wanted to accomplish. It was scary. And like I said, when I first picked up the author's proof and held it in my hand, I looked at the title and I looked at my name and I thought, who is this person? Who did this? So I think it's individual for each person, but to make that concrete decision, or to set a date, and to believe I've got something good here. This is something that has value. This is something that will make a difference in somebody's lives, and push through it.
Thank you for that, Yvonne. Angela, final question is going to go to you.
Final question. So I don't know about you, Yvonne, but when I think back of family gatherings that we had, holiday gatherings, I think that we often hear specific stories told in variations. And as a young adult, I noticed that my aunt's stories became bolder and more dramatic by the year. Did you find yourself thinking differently about specific life events after you wrote your dad's stories down versus hearing or remembering them?
I think the biggest difference for me was the clarity with which I understood who I was, what those stories meant, how my dad's life, my mother's life, how even understanding my grandparents and their struggles, how that all came together to make me be the person that I am. So I was really lucky, because when Dad told me the stories, they never got bigger. The context always stayed the same. So I never felt like he was, the fishing story that gets stretched. I never felt like that was happening. So I'll go back to that idea of just really being okay with who I am, because now I really knew how I came to be through the stories. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. So yeah, we indeed have reached the end of a great conversation with you, Yvonne. Thank you so very much for taking the time today. Please tell us where people can find you, where they can purchase your book, and what is the best way to get in touch with you.
Okay. So you can find the book anywhere. If you have an independent bookstore that is open, you can go in and ask them to order it. If they have a website, they will order it for you. Any online book retailer, I'm on Barnes & Noble and Amazon. My email address is Yvonne author, the number 4 at gmail.com. I'd be happy to respond to emails that I get.
Thank you. Can you hold up the book one more time for the more visually inclined people?
Is it?
Yeah, there you go. Thank you so much. Beautiful cover.
Absolutely. What a beautiful cover. What a wonderful book. What a wonderful story, Yvonne. Thank you for sharing that with us. And of course, thank you to all of you watching along at home. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to make sure we include all of the information there in our comment section. Yvonne, thank you for sharing that with us. And of course, to find out more about both upcoming and past Jefferson programs, as well as publications, please do head over to our website, www.jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan.
And Angela Beaumont.
Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us today.